It's now official. The Democrats are not only now a political party where it's okay to be a vicious foe of Israel, it's now the minority of Democrats who are not cheerleaders for the Palestinian-Arab war on the one Jewish state on the planet, who are the ones who are afraid to speak up for fear of being ostracized. The failure of most Democrats to denounce or distance themselves from Zohran Mamdani, their party's New York City mayoral candidate, is just the latest evidence that backing the survival of the Jewish state and even vigilance against Jew hatred is now largely a partisan issue which, as Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer told the leaders of Columbia University in 2023, is something only most Republicans care about. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with Fox News radio host and columnist Guy Benson about the political implications of the war on Israel and much else. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find The Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. It's been 2 weeks since the victory of Zohran Mamdani in the New York City Democratic mayoral primary, and whatever else one can say about it, there's one thing we know for sure. Most Democrats are neither distancing themselves from him or drawing a line in the sand about having people who are virulent foes of Israel represent their party. To the contrary, what we've quickly learned is that not only is there room in the Democratic Party for socialists who use traditional communist tropes, but also those who don't believe in the right of the one Jewish state on the planet to exist. Mamdani and his left-wing and liberal apologists claim they care about Jews, but only on condition that they give him a pass for anti-Semitic invective. But of course, the problem with Mamdani isn't just the hatred for Israel and the way he and his admirers are mainstreaming anti-Semitism. It's that his primary win is just the latest evidence that the woke intersectional left-wing base of the Democrats is gaining ground against a dwindling number of pro-Israel moderates who seem unable or unwilling to take a firm stand against radical positions on a host of issues. Nevertheless, that isn't the only form of extremism that isn't worth pondering right now. On the other end of the spectrum, the existence of a noisy, though at least to date, less influential faction of woke rightists, led by former Fox News host Tucker Carlson, who bizarrely seek to promote the agenda of an Islamist regime in Iran that hates the West and Israel as much as the far left. While they don't seem to have any influence on President Donald Trump, how worried should we be by the way both the far left and the far right are once again joining forces to oppose Israel and promote anti-Semitism? To discuss these issues, we're thrilled to have with us today one of the smartest conservative commentators on public affairs. Guy Benson is the political editor of townhall.com, a Fox News contributor, and a host of the nationally syndicated Guy Benson Show heard on the Fox News radio network. He is also the co-author of the 2015 book, End of Discussion. Guy Benson, welcome to Think Twice.
It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, Guy, we're thrilled to have you with us, and thanks for joining us today. I'd like to start by asking you about a piece you recently wrote about the shift within the Democratic Party on Israel. The polls have shown the contrast on the issue between Democrats and Republicans on Israel for decades. But since October 7th, 2023, it's become pretty apparent that the majority of Democrats are simply hostile to the Jewish state. What do you think the main reasons for their embrace of a Palestinian cause that would, on the face of it, seem to be antithetical to the liberal agenda, but still seems to be what they're thinking?
It's tough to puzzle through because it's so sad. I definitely am not a Democrat. I'm not a progressive by any stretch. People know my politics. But this was an issue where I was really hoping that at least a significant semblance of bipartisanship would remain, because it's one of those, to me, fairly black and white moral questions when it comes to Israel, certainly versus Hamas and other hostile actors in the region who want to kill Jews and eliminate the Jewish state. And for a long time, at least according to polling, there was fairly broad bipartisan support for Israel. And sometimes we would argue about specifics within the issue set. But there has been this sea change. I saw Harry Enton at CNN going through the data, and he seemed almost shocked on the air how dramatic it had been, almost a 50-point swing among Democrats against Israel. The question was asked, who do you sympathize more with, Israel or with Palestinians? And it's just been a huge, roughly 50-point move among Democrats. And what strikes me about your question and about the timeline is this movement really happened in earnest after October 7th, after the worst single-day massacre of Jews since the Holocaust by Palestinian terrorists. That was the impetus for a big stampede against the victims. And I just find it bizarre and pretty depressing, actually, that a movement that seems to kind of wrap itself in victimhood and grievance, and these are the things that they value, or at least they say that they do. Here is a case of actual bona fide victimhood. And they've decided, because for various ideological reasons, the victims are actually the bad guy and the oppressors, that they are going to move in the direction of the attackers, of the violent, deeply illiberal, theocratic enemy. They're going to move that direction because of this, I think, very warped identity fixation that they have on the left. And you've seen a movement among the elites, certainly on the left in the Democratic Party. You see some senators who kind of thought forever were pretty pro-Israel, and all of a sudden they're singing a different tune. I think they are seeing where the base is going, and they're trying to make sure that they're not left behind. So you have, I think when you have enough voices for enough time, I mean, the propaganda started on October 8th, right? In this country, at least, you woke up, the news was horrible, people were kind of getting their bearings, and within 12 to 24 hours, there were people in the streets, in our cities, on our campuses, agitating on behalf of the attackers. And that was, within hours of the atrocities. And the farther we've gotten away, the crazier the lies have gotten. But it has been a very steady drumbeat of dishonest propaganda. And I think the left likes to gravitate toward whatever the cause du jour might be. And, whatever makes you a good capital P progressive against the capital B bad people, that's the direction that you go. You don't really have to think too hard about it. We've seen that over and over again from the crazy riots of 2020 and so much groupthink during COVID. And unfortunately, this deeply demented cause has become the big one on the left. And people who
replacing even environmentalism is, if Greta Thunberg is the weather vane.
I think it's everything, right? I mean, Greta Thunberg apparently fixed the planet, and now she's off to obsess over the Jewish state, right? She's sort of hightailed it away from this existential threat to all of humanity to the new existential threat, which is a Jewish state, right? That's sort of part of the brainworms thing that we see from some of these people, and here we are. It's hard to fathom. It is distressing, but it's real. And, it's on one level, it's like, oh, here's another reason to be proud not to be part of that tribe, proud to be conservative. I generally vote for Republicans. I think they're just much better on the issue for the most part. But I wish this were an issue where I didn't feel like my side was better or worse. I wish we could just link arms on this one and a few others, but the polarization has now turned this increasingly into a partisan issue. And I have Jewish friends in particular who are Democrats, and also committed Zionists for many years. And they have felt very warm and comfortable in the Democratic Party for a long time. And you can see sort of almost the panic setting in and the shock setting in that a huge part of their party actively rejects the Jewish state. And there's a very nasty undercurrent, of course, of bigotry at play there as well. And it's just interesting watching them grapple with sort of their identity and their beliefs and their worldview and saying, okay, I still believe a lot of these elements of the Democratic coalition platform, et cetera, but given these allies, given now how they've made clear how they feel about me and the Jewish state and all of that, what does this mean for my future in this movement? I don't really want to join the other side for fill in the blank reasons, but I'm not sure I'm really belonging here much longer if the trends continue. And I feel bad. I'm not one of these people who is like, oh, we always told you, you should have been a right winger because these people, like, I don't want to like scold them and dunk on them. I think it's a really disorienting and scary thing. And it is for me as a non-Jewish person. It's scary for me to watch. I can only imagine how it feels being a Jewish person in the United States, especially on the left, and feeling like of anywhere in the world, and maybe including or outside of Israel, you are most safe here. And they're starting to question that in their everyday lives, even within their friend groups and their professional groups. And people, I've heard from many of them, like, I was there marching in 2020 after George Floyd. I was at the Women's March. They do all the intersectionality stuff. And then when it's their turn as real victims, the actual perpetrators have become the cause celeb on their side, and it's obviously distressing.
Is this really just just another manifestation of this broad culture war that we're having over critical race theory and intersectionality, settler colonialism, the war on the West, within academia, within all of our culture, which has, for some reason, which I guess is kind of makes sense, from a Marxist perspective, that the Jews and Israel are white oppressors, and by definition always wrong. So in a sense, this is kind of like a sidebar to a much bigger struggle that we've been having in this country. And it's not just about Jews, but it's certainly, is Jews are being made to feel it.
Yes, but I would also say, and maybe this is confirmation bias, or maybe, my social media feeds are curated with the algorithm that I see this stuff more than other causes, but it does really feel like this has become a vast global cause. Like, globalizing the Intifada has become a huge popular cause on the broader international left. And
Sure.
particularly among non-Muslims, right? So, you have the general, like, actual perpetrators of Intifada, and then you have the fetishists of Intifada, and they tend to be left-wingers in Western countries. And I think it's a manifestation of anti-Western civilization, which is what the hard left has been about in this country. They hate, first and foremost, the United States of America. Here's an opportunity to try to drive to create a schism or drive something of a disagreement between the U.S. and one of our most important allies. Israel is successful. Israel is thriving. Israel is, by and large, capitalistic in a lot of ways, right? I would object to any number of their policies, right? See, I criticize Israel. I think socialized medicine is a bad idea.
Listen, as I always say, 8 million Israeli Jews get up every day and criticize their government for one reason or another, just as 330 million Americans get up every day and criticize their government. The issue isn't criticism of a government. It's whether one Jewish state on the planet is one too many.
Right, exactly, which they believe it is because of all this crazy, oppressor-oppressed binary that they've created. And it's such stupid, simplistic thinking, and they're fully steeped in it. And it's like, okay, if this is the thing that we're doing together, and so some of it's just sort of, I think, lazy, go along with the thing du jour. I think there's a lot of that from absolutely ignorant people. You've seen the videos of people being asked, you're chanting about the river and the sea. Can you name either of them? The river or the sea? And they can't. They have no idea what they're talking about. So there's a lot of that. It's driven by, at the top, though, what I call it the dirtbag alliance between Islamism and hardcore leftism. And those people know what they're doing. And they actually shouldn't agree on much, because I think if it was reduced down to just the Islamists and the hardcore leftists, I think many of these hardcore leftists would be in for a very rude awakening. But at the moment, at least, it is a useful alliance, the dirtbag alliance, because they hate the West, they hate Western values, they hate Western civilization itself, they hate the United States, and they hate Israel. So that's where they align. And if that means you have a bunch of, pierced, purple-haired Antifa-type people devoting seemingly their entire passion and life and personality to hating the Jewish state because that's their way of raging against a broader civilization set of values that they really hate and want to tear down, they've glommed onto it. And it's astounding and a bit shocking what people are capable of when they go all in for a cause, even one that they don't really know very much about. They are willing to say and chant and do and defend and justify things that I would imagine under almost any other circumstance they could never imagine doing. They would never be like, oh yes, let me whitewash and deny and even justify mass rape for a moment. That's something that a few causes ago would have gotten someone excommunicated and canceled forever. But if it serves this new cause, then they contort themselves into these positions of, a combination of, oh, it didn't happen, or if it did happen, it's justified because of this whole scale of, of oppression or whatever. I don't envy people who have to go through these gymnastics to sleep at night and live with themselves. But, they get so caught up in it, they really think that they're the good guys, right? They are the righteous, virtuous people, and people like you and me are just these awful genocide supporters who have to be stopped. I mean, many of them have convinced themselves of that. And I think a lot of it has been driven, I think those are mostly the sheep who are lied to rather easily. And it's a big problem. I think more insidious and more sinister are the people doing the lying.
Yeah.
Virtually 24/7 since October 8th.
Right. Now, of course, the news story that was sort of the manifestation of this sea change within the Democrats that we've already referred to was the victory of Zohran Mamdani in New York as the Democratic mayoral primary winner. Now, New York isn't a bellwether, but it was still significant for someone who basically, won't condemn globalized intifada, is himself, been guilty of a lot of the same sort of genocide talk and really, at best, anti-Semitism adjacent beliefs, winning in the most Jewish city in America. But I think the interesting thing about him is not so much his ability to win a Democratic primary in New York City, but the fact that very few members of his party are prepared to condemn or distance themselves from them in the manner the Democrats always demand that Republicans do with respect to extremists on the right. To the contrary, they've closed ranks around him, and nothing, not his communist rhetoric, anti-Israel and anti-Semitism, or his calling himself an African American on one of his college applications is considered disqualifying. That tells us something not only about the Democrats' Overton window moving, but about what is mainstream discourse on the left these days.
Yeah, I think he is mainstream on the left. I mean, he's objectively extremist, but subjectively, within the tent. The African-American thing is funny because, again, just like the, rape culture, rape denial thing, especially during the Me Too movement, where I think there were some overdue examples of accountability that came about because of that movement. And then there was vast excess that happened as a result of that movement. But if you were questioning any of the excess at the time, it was like, wow, you're part of rape culture. And now they've embraced a literal rape culture in Hamas, right? With African-American, this was another one. I mean, they are so obsessed with identity and with the box-checking exercises. And then here's a guy who is, according to their own rules, appropriating someone else's race and culture and victimhood, and therefore status for his own purposes. And they kind of just basically, at least the activists, seem cool with it because ultimately it's not about any specific cause. It's about the big umbrella cause of anti-American, anti-Western, hardcore leftism. And so if your hero du jour violated one of the big rules, but it's helped him, so be it.
Yeah.
If I was born in the Middle East. If I had tried to use that, I was born to American parents as an American citizen, but if I had decided that I'm going to use that and try to figure out the best way to abuse that to get into whatever job or university or whatever, so I happen to get into my top choice on my own, so I'm proud of that. But I felt like I had needed to, right? I like, okay, gosh, maybe I'm not good enough. Let me figure out a way to kind of leverage or even weaponize part of my biography in a dishonest way to get some sort of advantage. And then that came out about me, these people would crucify me. But because
have it help you. Yeah.
because it's him, they're like, oh, I think the 1619 Project lady came out, I think on social media, I saw her saying like, oh, well, there's a difference between racially black and politically black. And basically saying, well, this guy's politically black, so, good enough for me. It was the subtext, or maybe not even the subtext, is the excuse. And so that's another thing about the hard left and the overall movement is it's the term that I often come back to is Calvin ball, where it's just there are no rules and you make up the rules as you go along. And the rules exist and they are enforced ruthlessly against people that you want to. And then the rules are discarded without a second thought when necessary or completely rewritten because the new thing requires it. That is what it's like watching these people operate. And it kind of makes you crazy as you watch this go down. The good news is I do feel like a lot of, and not just in the United States, a lot of common sense normals in the West are pretty sick of it. They've been bullied by these psychos for the better part of a decade, especially the last half decade, and a lot of people have reached their limit. And I mean, there's many reasons why Donald Trump is president of the United States right now, but one of them, I think, was a backlash to all of this.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Now, one aspect of this discussion about Mamdani, which we've already noted in the college application issue, and you noted the 1619 lady, Nicole Hannah-Jones, the fury of the Times left-wing readership at the paper, including some of its staff at the Times, committing an act of journalism.
Yep.
The hypocrisy also because they had criticized Donald Trump a year ago when he questioned whether Kamala Harris was authentically African-American. They said, no, you can't do that. That's racist, but it's okay for them to question. But aside from that, I think what boxes he checked off when applying to college isn't so much the issue as the fact that his entire life and career embodies the DEI agenda and the idea of racial classifications which progressives seek to impose on the nation, including wanting, he wants to tax people who live in quote unquote whiter neighborhoods more than those who don't. The fact that a child of privilege like him, because, he's the son of a filmmaker and a Columbia professor, could use being designated as a member of protected minorities to potentially take a seat away in a class or funding away from a just as, if not more deserving middle or working class kid matters. And the impact of the entire woke agenda that he supports and wishes to implement is exactly what is at the heart of Trump's, war against Harvard and Columbia.
Yeah, he's a rich kid. And when I saw that, I'm like, of course he is. I've also seen AOC trying to sort of embellish her working class roots, saying that I'm a girl from the Bronx. Then a lot of people were like, hang on, I went to school with you in this other suburb. What are you talking here? I hear you are.
She's from Westchester.
Right. It's sort of like, okay, they want so desperately to have this image because that's what the tribe requires, or at least they think that's what it requires. So they end up being so inauthentic in certain ways. But yeah, with Mamdani specifically, one thing that sticks out to me about him, because I was doing some research into him weeks before the primary and started to talk about it on my show on Fox, and tweeting about it more because I'm like, oh, this guy might have a real chance of becoming mayor of New York City, which is really, really stunning. And one of the things that I learned was the day after October 7th, he put out a statement that was terrible. And within a few days, like within a week of October 7th, he was arrested at Chuck Schumer's house. He went to the Jewish Senate Majority Leader's house. Basically, remember that was one of these, like, before Israel was defending itself, when Israel was first trying to figure out how to count the dead, account for who was taken, hostage and kidnapped, and then what to do. Before Israel had done anything, these people were already accusing it of genocide and war crimes and, stop the war and all the things. Like, we get to our side, Hamas gets to start the war, slaughter a bunch of people, and now we need a ceasefire. This is what they wanted. And because Schumer is at least nominally pro-Israel, he is in some ways, arguably less so in other ways, but Mamdani and that mob showed up at Schumer's house to preemptively protest what the Jewish state half a world away might do in response to this massive massacre. And he was put in handcuffs. You're protesting and blocking traffic and trespassing and, public, I think it was like disorderly conduct, I think was the charge, something like that. You are days away. They are still counting bodies. They are still trying to figure out who's been taken hostage, who's dead. And your move is to show up at Chuck Schumer's house to protest whatever Israel might do. That is Zohran Mamdani.
Yeah.
And he is an absolute fanatic on this. You look through the years, he was publicly very concerned about the Boston Marathon bomber, having full due process and making sure every I was dotted, every T was crossed, having just murdered a bunch of Americans. He was very upset about al-Awlaki, the al-Qaeda operative, being taken out by Obama. President Obama droned. He was a U.S. citizen, but a hardcore al-Qaeda cleric who had gone abroad and is an enemy combatant. Obama droned him. I know it was controversial because he was a U.S. citizen, but Mamdani took it another step and was blaming the U.S. government for radicalizing al-Awlaki. So sympathetic to Hamas, sympathetic to a major al-Qaeda figure, sympathetic to, an ISIS-inspired or al-Qaeda-inspired bomber that killed a bunch of innocent people at a race in Boston. You start to see the pattern, and I want to be careful about how I characterize him and his beliefs, but that trifecta does not speak well. I'll put it that way. And then I saw another thing just yesterday. It was a post, a little essay that he had written back in college, I believe. So he's been insufferable for many years, where he was lamenting how in class has to be the one who constantly brings everything back to race, and saying, do I jump in and correct people for their inaccurate pronunciations of Indian names? Yes, I do. And I jump in and once again raise the important racial aspects of the conversation. He's like, I can practically feel my classmates rolling their eyes or sighing in silence at me because I'm that guy. And basically, he's like, what a martyr I am, how exhausting it is to have to be around these ignoramuses and open their eyes to racial consciousness at all times. Like, he was that guy. Extremely annoying. Back in the day, he has changed. He has never changed. He is still that exact same person. And now he's likely going to be the mayor of New York City.
Yeah. It's shocking. Let's take a detour from the question of, about the Middle East and talk a little bit about another issue in terms of the focus of the mainstreaming of extremist positions of Democrats, the focus of most of the anger, against Trump that we just saw on display last month in the No Kings rallies across the country. It was their opposition to ICE raids that sought to enforce immigration laws. Under Biden, the open border was at least in part a sin of omission in which he refused to enforce the law while still insisting that he wasn't doing anything of the kind. But now it appears the left's definition of tyranny monarchical rule, is seeking to uphold the rule of law with respect to illegal immigration, a stand that I think is kind of like biological men competing in women's sports, sort of an 80-20 issue. Why are the Democrats going there? Well, what polling? What is telling them that that's, the future for their party and that's a winning issue?
I'm not sure they convinced themselves that it's a winning issue or done any due diligence that it's a winning issue. I just think it's kind of emotive, right? It's a very emotions-driven party and movement. I sometimes call them the party of theater kids. And I like theater kids and I like theater, but I also don't necessarily want them running the country. And I think it's sort of like, okay, what is a wide enough net to cast? All right, no kings. Trump's a king, Trump's a dictator. That's wide. So like, come one, come all with whatever grievance you have. I'm not quite sure if you're upset about this, you're upset about that. If you're a huge hater of Israel and Hamas supporter, or you're really into unlimited abortion, or you want ICE agents to be shot in the street, or you hate Elon Musk, and you've been firebombing
another African American, I might add.
Right, exactly. Is that allowed? What are the rules here? And the rules, again, they just don't apply. They don't apply equally to anyone. That's the point. It's almost the lack of standards is the point. But it's like, whatever your pet issue is, we're going to just decide that counts within no kings. So show up and protest. And look, it's fine. I generally didn't have much of a problem with the No Kings protest because to me it was incoherent. I felt like No Kings Day is actually the 4th of July. We have one every year. But if you guys want to go in the streets and protest peacefully, which is what these protests overwhelmingly actually were across the country, there were exceptions, and those are always horrible, and you get a lot of that on the left, and the media ignores it, whitewashes it, et cetera, whereas that would be the only focus if it were a right-wing protest movement. Be that as it may, it was generally peaceful. And I definitely prefer it to the riots in Los Angeles and the firebombing of Tesla dealerships and the violent takeover of university buildings on behalf of Hamas. We've seen so much violent protest and violent unrest and criminality on the left. By contrast, No Kings felt a little silly and a little unfocused. And I had friends who participated because it's like a pressure valve, right? You're out of power. The nightmare has come true. Donald Trump is president again. The Supreme Court has a sensible majority, thank God. Hopefully for quite some time. Congress is, in the process of passing a law that you've been told will be a disaster and all that. And in a democracy or a republic, with free speech, the way to channel that frustration and angst and concern is to go out with your signs and your chants and have your say. Even if I think it's really dumb and silly, the No Kings thing didn't really bother me. I've been much more bothered by a lot less healthy manifestations of anger. So part of me almost felt like we should be encouraging our friends on the left. Do a No Kings every week or every month if you want to, if it then precludes some of the much more dangerous criminal violent stuff that elements of your movement have been up to.
Yeah. To turn back to foreign policy, I want to note a piece you recently wrote that interested me about something that's been missing from the discussion about the U.S. strike on Iranian nuclear targets, the fact that all 4 of the living ex-presidents of the United States, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Biden, who all pledged not to let Tehran get a nuclear weapon, all of them refused to endorse Trump's decision to do what they said they'd do if it came to it. Is it just their joint bipartisan antipathy for Trump, kind of the manifestation, the ultimate manifestation of what some people call the uniparty, Republicans as well as Democrats? Or is it that they never really meant it when they made those promises about Iran?
So, or could it be a little bit of embarrassment? Like, hey, we all talked really tough. And then this guy, who we consider a clown, actually did the very serious thing that we never did. And I do wonder how many of them sitting there like, you know what, given the exact circumstances, Would I have done the exact same thing? I think several of them would have. I do. I hope. I think they would have. But they never got to that point. They never did it. He did it. So it's Clinton, it's Obama, it's Biden, it's Bush. So I interned for Bush. He was my first vote in 2004, first presidential vote in 2004. I was an intern in his White House in 2007. Great respect for the man. I think you've seen his post-presidency approval numbers come way up, favorability numbers come way up, largely because he has stayed away from politics.
Right.
You know, he's followed in the old tradition of, I did my 8 years, I'm out, and I'm not going to...
He hasn't made a statement about anything.
So I give him a lot of slack on not giving a statement. I think they'll put out statements very, very occasionally, like, you know, the flooding in Texas, and which is a horrible story, very, very, very occasionally. But in terms of active political debates, generally he has been utterly silent since 2009. And so I give him a pass, right? Like, if you're not going to come out and say anything ever, I respect the hell out of that. And you're sticking with it. If I had to guess, I think Bush probably privately supports Trump's decision. He just didn't comment on it because he never comments. Some of these other guys comment a lot, right? Bill Clinton is not shy, ever. Barack Obama is not shy. He comes out, he's screaming about autocracy and going and, you know, doing his thing. Joe Biden even broke his post-presidential silence within a few months and gave a speech criticizing Trump. I think some of it is embarrassment that Trump was the guy to actually fulfill all of their promises. Like, they had a unified, unanimous red line that Donald Trump enforced. By the way, I believe this is the second red line of Obama's that Trump has been forced to enforce because Obama wouldn't.
Right.
And Obama did a lot worse than he didn't enforce the red line in Syria. Much worse than that, he enabled the Iranian regime, in my view, and enriched them undeniably. So I think there's maybe some embarrassment. I think there's this general little fraternity that they've got, and the three ones who speak out are all Democrats, so they hate Trump, of course, on an extra level than even some traditional Republicans might. I think that's part of it, but it was striking to me because here was a successful strike. Even if you want to frame it as giving credit to the military, you can do that, right? You can credit the military with successful strikes to, at a significant level, cripple the nuclear weapons program of a sworn enemy of the United States that went off without a hitch perfectly. You can kind of just raise your hand as a former commander-in-chief who had drawn that red line repeatedly and said, hey, attaboy to the men and women of our armed forces, even if you don't want to mention the president, which I think would be a little petty and classless, but they could say Trump is petty and classless. Fine. Say you chime in and you weigh in all
the U.S. Air Force.
Right, exactly. But they didn't, at least to my knowledge, when I wrote the piece, I scoured everywhere, I had seen nothing. I don't know if there's been a comment from any of them. I don't know if any of them has any of them been asked? Have any of them been asked a question about this by anyone? It's been weeks.
Yeah.
It's one of the most significant military decisions an American president has made in decades. Strange.
Yeah,
strange,
it is strange.
Revealing, and again, disappointing, right? Barack Obama made his star in 2004 with the "We are not blue America or red America, we're the United States of America." Now, of course, that's not how he governed at all. But that was at least the conceit that catapulted him to success. And I don't know, I mean, I know some members of his administration seemed almost personally hard hit by the Iran strikes because they were...
Ben Rhodes was really angry about it.
Ben Rhodes and Tommy Vieta, or however you say his name, you know, the Obama bros were really committed to this fantasy about Iran, and that all completely ended under Trump, or at least largely was put an end to by Trump, because, you know, he had this... I think they kind of liked the idea of Iran being at least in the region, the regional hegemon. They didn't necessarily love all of their terrorism, but they were like, okay, you know, they're going to do what they're going to do. And they liked the Iranians having a bunch of leverage. They don't care much for the state of Israel, obviously. And here you have Israel and the United States teaming up like a real alliance defanging in a hugely embarrassing, humiliating way to the Iranian regime, this regime that they were kind of propping up and trying to remake the Middle East sort of oriented toward Iran, and the whole project collapsed thanks to a man that they despise in Donald Trump and a country they despise in Israel. I mean, Ben Rhodes, famously, his nickname inside the West Wing among his colleagues was Hamas. They called him Hamas because he hated Israel that much. So to see the success of Israel in Gaza, in Lebanon, and then in Iran, and then Trump coming in with the big American blow at the end, I'm sure was difficult for them. So color me totally unsurprised that Barack Obama said nothing about the Iranian strikes. If anything, it's like you'd almost be worried what he would say.
Yeah.
But the others, with the exemption of Bush, because he never says anything, it's like, you can play the sound bites. There have been the montages put together. You all said this. It's the position, it is the unified, nonpartisan, bipartisan position of the United States government that Iran can never get nuclear weapons. And there was an incredible opportunity to eliminate that threat or at least vastly set it back. And the commander-in-chief took it, and there's crickets.
Yeah. No,
Fascinating.
you're absolutely right about that. And certainly the Obama people, some of whom were, again, Biden people, were for a rapprochement and, beyond appeasement of Iran. And so, yes, they were heavily invested in the Iranian project, and it's a defeat for them.
No.
But another troubling aspect about the discussion about the Iranian nuclear threat, and this is something that I think hits home, especially for conservatives, is the way, for want of a better term, what we've been calling the woke right, in the form of people like former Fox News host Tucker Carlson and people even more extreme than him like Candace Owens, have embraced the cause of a country like Iran that has considered itself at war with the West and the United States, as well as Israel, since 1979. This goes, way beyond opposition to forever wars and nation building, which Trump's effort to stop Iran was not. It seems to be the point where the extreme right and the extreme left come together, as they have in the past in history, to express their antipathy to somebody who, to an anti-Semitic country, their antipathy to Israel and Jews, and not a coherent set of ideas about foreign policy. What's your explanation, or at least your ideas about why Tucker, among others, have chosen to go there, even if it causes them to move away from someone they supposedly support like Trump? The question is, what's the motivation for someone like Carlson to really put themselves at odds with Trump in favor of Iran, where he's just basically doing propaganda interviews for the president of Iran this week?
I don't know. I don't want to try to climb inside anyone's head. I think you mentioned Candace, for example. I think that there's clearly some real derangement. And I think for some people, it's just chasing the most unhinged conspiracy that you possibly can. And there's this constant desire to tell an audience that, you're being lied to by the establishment or whatever, and the real truth. And you're constantly sort of seeking the next sugar high of crazy. And that can send you down some very dark paths. And I think for some people, that is the case. They absolutely refuse to engage in reality and facts in some cases. I know that there were some very dramatic predictions made about what would happen if Trump didn't fall their way and instead did exactly what he did. If Trump did what he did, the parade of horribles, the cascade of disaster would be immediate and, deadly on a vast scale, and all of these things. And none of it came true, right? The World War III didn't happen. The allies of Iran did not come rushing in. The Russians and the Chinese did not come rushing in to create a third world war in defense of Iran. A lot of the Arab world put out sort of like wink statements of condemnation, but behind the scenes were rooting openly for Israel and the United States, and were actually helping logistically, as they had a few different times recently, the Israelis. I mean, all of that, these tens of thousands of Americans will be dead. The price of oil will skyrocket instantly, and people's livelihoods will be destroyed. None of that happened. And so, I would just, without trying to puzzle through some of the motives of some of these people, I would just say, like, if you're part of the audience and you are, perhaps you could call it one of the marks, and you have now had this object lesson in presidential decision-making, predictions, and then reality. Perhaps you can draw some conclusions about credibility on other subjects as well. If someone has gotten something this big, this wrong, this loudly, I would start to question a little bit, if even someone that I was a big fan of, and it'd be one thing if they came out and like with a big mea culpa, like, hey, I thought all this was going to happen. I pushed the president in the other direction. He made the call, and, hindsight, I got it wrong. He got it right. Good for him. This was good for all these reasons. And I still have these concerns about externalities in the future. But overall, like, if there was some candor and some humility, that'd be one thing. But instead, it's sort of, like doubling, tripling down, talking to this little, really demented echo chamber that's divorced from reality is a very strange thing to see. I would say there is definitely an extremist fringe on the right that has a major anti-Semitism problem. There's no doubt about that. And no, I'm not saying that all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. I think that's another just lazy argument and sometimes anti-Semitism is used unfairly and thrown at everything or over-applied, and I don't think that's good or helpful. But also trying to say, like, oh, well, they call everything anti-Semitism, and surely my anti-Semitism doesn't count, right? But I do still believe that element on the right is a fringe. Coming full circle back to the beginning of our conversation, unfortunately, I feel like that extremist fringe on the left is not a fringe at all, is very much now within their mainstream coalition, and threatens to become a dominant force within that coalition, I think, soon. Because the people who are steeped in this, ignorantly or otherwise, seem to be the most hardcore, youngest left-wingers, which is why college campuses have been ground zero for a lot of this. And, it's not a surprise that Zohran Mamdani is such a young guy and has such support among young leftists. So, I think on the right, it's important to, and I've seen a lot of gatekeeping and a lot of guardrailing of a lot of people calling out some very big names on our side or within the tribe over these issues. I think it really helps that Trump made the right decision and that Trump's right decision was vindicated in the court of public opinion. But I think there is an effort to really go after people and to engage them and to highlight what they've said and what they've done. Whereas I think the guardrails are just basically, if not obliterated, pretty darn close on the left, which again it does not bring me any pleasure at all to say that on this front. It's scary and it's disappointing. And it is worrisome if we're going to end up with a major political party in this country dominated by people who would sympathize with effectively a violent, anti-Western, anti-American, anti-Semitic movement over a pluralistic democracy that is a great ally to the United States, whose enemies are also our enemies. And if it becomes like an R versus D, red versus blue thing, I just don't know. That's not sustainable, right? A house divided against itself cannot stand. If you've got a pro-Hamas majority in the base of one political party, I don't know how we grapple with that as a society and as a country.
Yeah, well, we have to hope that, as often happens in American political history, when parties go too far to one extreme or another, they get a tremendous whooping, and then they get some sanity.
The fever breaks,
yeah.
Or maybe more likely, there's a new thing.
Yeah.
right? So I think the hard...
One shudders to think what the next thing would be, but...
Exactly. But like, okay, you know, the hardcore Islamist Hamas people are always going to be obsessed with Israel and the Jewish state. But a lot of the hangers-on and the slacktivists and the social media, you know, Instagram story posters who are just barfing up whatever they're given by their side, perhaps their attention span will be distracted by some new cause du jour, and they'll move on from this one. But for people with such short attention spans, the hating Israel and the genocide lie has really stuck, has some staying power, right? It's been the better part of 2 years now, which is kind of extraordinary.
Yeah. Lastly, in the time that we have left, I'd like to ask you about the Trump 2.0 administration, how it's doing. If you only read the New York Times or watch MSNBC or some of the other left-wing outlets, you may think we're only a couple of steps away from the end of democracy and that Trump is failing on every front. But the reality is that he's strung together a series of victories, both at home and abroad, and despite some missteps and a feud with Elon Musk. How do you think he's doing? And do you believe... what do you think are the landmines that he needs to avoid in order to keep from being sidetracked or setting himself up for failure in 2026?
Yeah. I mean, I think overall, he's done pretty well, right? People know I've never been the huge Trump guy, all right? I'm very open about that, but I also try to be fairly objective, or at least intellectually honest and reasonable about stuff. And, certainly, I think the outcomes have been immeasurably better than they would have been if Kamala Harris had won. I'm concerned still about the tariffs and how that all gets resolved. People are saying like, oh, look, the economy's still doing really well with the tariffs. Well, a lot of the tariffs have been paused, right? So you unpause that and you can open up another can of worms. I think he would be wise, in my opinion, to just try to make the economy 2019 again. And he's taken some significant steps, like the big beautiful bill, as they call it. I have some real problems with it, but overall, I supported it because you can't have a $4 trillion tax increase hit every income group and every business at the end of the year. That would be a catastrophe. And with the tiny margins that they've got, between Trump and the team and Speaker Johnson and Leader Thune, I mean, what a job they did to shepherd that thing through. The border crossings, illegal border crossings have slowed to a trickle, basically to virtually a rounding error compared to what it was. Iran, what a tremendous success that was. Low risk, low cost, all in, but still a gutsy, tough decision to make, and he made it. So yeah, I have concerns. I think some of the appointments have been a little kooky. I would love to see good, qualified, young conservative judges being appointed at a much faster clip. I feel like they were much more focused on that in the first term, and I think they need to get back to that. That's a legacy thing that lasts for a generation at least. So yeah, I certainly have my concerns and my critiques. And he's got all sorts of shortcomings as a human being. We all do, but he's a real character. But I think it's been a relatively successful second term so far. And, they can shriek and shriek and shriek, and that's fine. That's opposition. But I'm not sure it's working the way that it did the first time. And I would say, and they're all of a sudden very concerned about the Constitution, which they don't seem to be very concerned about the Constitution when they're in power and doing whatever they want and running roughshod over it. Another judge just came out and struck down an act of Congress. Congress just changed their purse strings decision on Planned Parenthood. Completely the job of Congress, signed into law by President Trump, and some judge, because it's an abortion provider, decide, oh, well, that's unconstitutional. I think that type of thing is actually a threat to the constitutional order, but it's rarely treated as such because there's a whole separate conversation for another day. So much of the so-called news media, they're not just left-leaning, they are the tip of the spear of left-wing activism in the Democratic base. When they criticize Democrats, it is generally from the left or from the perspective of, how did you lose this for us, our side? And so even when you have flagrant extra-constitutional or unconstitutional behavior on the left, it's either kind of ignored, downplayed, or celebrated, whereas anything that might have a whiff of autocracy or an abuse of power for Trump is hair on fire, 11 out of 10. And then you get a boy who cried wolf syndrome, where I think sometimes Trump does overreach and needs to be pushed back against. And they're so 11 out of 10 on everything that a lot of people just tune it out. And then they're also hypocrites because they're fine with trampling the Constitution so long as it serves their ideological purposes and ends, which is why it's hard for me to take some of this seriously. And then there's people who I think try to be consistent, and I try to listen and pay attention to them. If you are consistent and you are calling out the left and the Democrats on constitutional overreach, and then you have a scathing piece about Trump, I am much more likely to read that and consider that argument than, all this other hackery that's out there.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right about that. Guy, thanks so much for joining us today. Taking a break from your vacation, you can go back to enjoying.
I'm dressed like vacation, I feel like.
Yes, and that's fine. You can hear Guy on his nationally syndicated radio show on the Fox News Radio Network. Read him on townhall.com. Follow him on X at Guy P. Benson. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.